Hi, everyone. I'm Nicole Leone, and today I want to talk about something I see all the time in small businesses and nonprofits, which is this very particular kind of drag that happens when a project is technically moving but somehow feels stuck. Everybody is working, everybody is trying. There are meetings, updates, follow ups, revised timelines, status checks, and all the usual signs of activity. And yet the work itself starts to feel heavier than it should, slower than it should, more confusing than it should. This is what this training is all about. I want to walk through why projects stall, what that usually looks like in real life, and the framework I use to diagnose the problem before teams waste even more time, energy, and goodwill. It usually starts the same way every time. On the surface, the project looks alive. Everyone's busy, meetings are happening, updates are flying around, people are in motion, but progress still feels thin. That disconnect is important because motion and momentum are not the same thing. A team can be doing a whole lot and still not be moving cleanly toward their outcome. And this is why stalled work is so frustrating. It can look active even though nobody realizes how much energy is being burned without much real forward movement. Stalled work usually creeps up on you. It's not dramatic, but shows up in smaller, more repetitive ways. The same open items come up week after week. Deadlines slide quietly, people leave meetings with slightly different understandings of what was decided. Work has to be redone. Or it gets stuck between one person and the next because the handoff was never fully clear. From the outside, this can look like a busy team doing their best. And often that's exactly what it is. People are working hard and they're trying to get things done. But underneath the effort, the structure of the work is starting to break down. Ownership gets fuzzy, decisions stay open, people compensate by checking in more, following up more, and trying harder, which takes even more time. The harder they work, the more frustrating it becomes when the project still feels like nobody knows where it is and where it's going. That is why I always say busy is not the same as moving. When this happens, most teams usually make the same assumption for why things are stalled. They think the problem is accountability, or it's time management, or it's a bandwidth issue, or people aren't following up enough. Sometimes that's actually true. Sometimes there is a capacity problem or there's a performance issue that needs to be addressed. But often those things are just symptoms of a bigger problem, not the root cause. The team doesn't necessarily need more pressure or more reminders or more meetings. It just needs a better diagnosis from the start. Because if the structure around the work is weak, all the pressure in the world is just going to make people feel worse while the same confusion keeps repeating itself. When I'm working with teams that have stalling problems, I try to make a useful distinction with them. Is this a workload problem or is this a clarity problem? A workload problem is exactly what it sounds like. There's too much work, not enough people to do it, not enough capacity. That is a real thing that a lot of teams struggle with. That is a resource issue. But on the other hand, a clarity problem, it feels similar from the inside, but it's actually very different. A clarity problem is when priorities are fuzzy, ownership is unclear, decisions stay open for way too long, and handoffs are messy. The team is busy not only because the work exists, but because the work is not structured clearly. This creates a lot of problems. It creates duplication of work, it creates waiting, it creates a lot of confusion. And the tricky thing is that from inside the organization, a clarity problem can feel exactly like overwhelm. People know that they're tired and the work is taking too long, but they don't necessarily know why. This distinction between workload problems and clarity problems matters a lot. In my experience, projects don't really break all at once. They break in small little places repeatedly until things really start to go off the rails. One or more of these four things usually happens when I look at a project that is having trouble moving forward. First, the priorities have not been ranked clearly enough. Everybody's saying that everything is high priority all the time, or there's no distinction between what needs to be done now or later. Two, there are decisions that are still open, but nobody has fully named them, nobody knows who needs to make them or when. Three, the deadlines were set before the actual build of the work was understood, so a lot of the timelines don't really make sense in the context of the entire project. Four, the handoffs between people are muddy, so work sits in the gap because they don't know who they're waiting for or what they're supposed to do next. These are operational breakpoints. They're not personality flaws. They don't prove that the team is lazy or that nobody cares. It's just the repeated breakdown in the structure of the execution. Once you start looking for these breakpoints, you can usually spot why a project feels heavier than it should and is not moving. When a project feels stalled, this is the framework that I use to make a diagnosis. PODH: priority, ownership, decisions, handoffs. These are the first four places I look because these are the places where execution usually gets kind of confusing. It's a diagnostic, not a rigid sequence. I'm not saying that every project moves through this in perfect order, but I'm saying that if work feels stuck, one or more of these areas is usually at least part of the reason why. And the nice thing about this framework is that it's simple enough to use pretty quickly. You don't need a giant system or a long retreat to kind of diagnose what's happening in this project. You just need to be honest about what's actually happening. Let's look at priority first. When a team sits down with me and says, everything is urgent, it needs to be done right now, I usually know I'm looking at a sorting problem. Everything cannot be urgent. If everything is urgent, then nobody has really decided what comes first. So I ask a simple question. What is the real priority right now? Not the 10 things people are most worried about, not the loudest thing, not the most visible thing, the real, actual priority. What must move first for the rest of the work to move well? That question usually cuts through a lot of the problems. A team that can't name the top priority clearly is almost always going to feel scattered. People are going to jump between requests, respond to whoever's speaking loudest, and spend their energy managing pressure instead of sequence. If everything is a priority, nothing is. And a lot of stall work begins right here. Next is ownership. Who is driving each major piece of the work? I mean, really, really driving it, not just like a little bit attached to it, not vaguely involved, not one of three people who are kind of circling around it. Like, who is really responsible for movement of this project? This matters because shared ownership often sounds collaborative, but in practice, it can create a drift. Several people are touching the work, but nobody is steering it. Nobody's watching the blockers, the next steps, the open loops, or the dependencies. And this is when things start to wobble. Many people can contribute to a project like this. That's normal. But one person needs to know with no ambiguity that they are the one driving it forward. If everyone owns it, then nobody's owning it. And when ownership is vague, projects start to stall quietly. Then we get to decisions and handoffs. Open decisions are one of the biggest hidden blockers in project work. The team is technically moving, but they're revising around something that has not actually been decided. They're waiting for approval or alignment or final language or direction, but nobody has surfaced that clearly enough. So I always ask, what is still undecided? Who is making that decision? And when does it need to be made by? If you don't name open decisions, they sit in the middle of the project like invisible furniture. Everyone keeps bumping into them, but nobody removes them. Then there's handoffs. A lot of projects do not stall while someone is actively doing the work. They stall in that gap between when person A is doing it and person B is doing it. One person thinks they're finished, another person doesn't realize it's now their turn, someone assumes feedback has been incorporated when it hasn't been. That is a handoff problem. So, what I want to know from teams is this: where is the work getting stuck between people? How does the next person know that the project is now theirs or the task is now theirs? What marks the handoff as complete? Invisible blockers are still blockers. Once I diagnose the problem, one of the fastest tools I use is simple triage. I sort the active work into three buckets: must happen now, must happen next, and can be parked. That's it. Must happen now means there's a real deadline, a real dependency, or a real consequence if it slips between the cracks. Matters next or coming up next means it's important, but it's not allowed to hijack all that we're doing today. Can be parked means it's still valid work, but it does not need attention right now. This is incredibly helpful because most teams are not drowning in equally urgent work. They're drowning in unranked work. Once the ranking becomes visible, the temperature comes down a lot. People can breathe, they can focus, they can stop reacting to everything all at once and start moving through the work in actual order. That alone can release a lot of unnecessary drag. Let's talk a bit about deadlines now. When a deadline slips, most people jump immediately to frustration. They assume somebody dropped the ball, they didn't do what they were supposed to do, and they didn't tell anybody. Sometimes that is true. But before we blame the person who missed, I look at the build. Was the deliverable clearly defined? Was there one owner? Were the dependencies visible from the start? Were approvals and feedback built into the timeline? If the answer to any of these is no, the deadline was shaky long before the person missed it. This is such an important mindset shift because if it moves the conversation from blame to design. Instead of asking why the team failed, you start asking whether the structure made success possible. A deadline is only as strong as the structure behind it, and weakly built deadlines are one of the most common reasons execution starts to break. Let's put this in the context of a simple example. Let's say a nonprofit is preparing for a campaign launch. There's messaging, a donation page, email copy, leadership review, internal coordination, and a public launch date. Everyone is very busy, everyone is very involved, and suddenly it feels like everything is behind. If I step into that situation as an outsider, I'm not starting with who dropped the ball. I'm running the framework. What is the priority? What has to be ready first for this launch to happen well? Who owns each major stream of this work? Messaging, page build, approvals, deployment. What decisions are still open? Are we changing the message? Are we still debating audience? Are we still waiting on leadership approval? And where do the handoffs happen? And who do they happen between? Once messaging is approved, how does it move to email and web? Once the page is built, who reviews it? Who consolidates the edits? Then I triage the work. What needs to happen now? What happens tomorrow, next week, next month? And what can be parked for the future? Then I'll audit the deadline itself. Is this date supported by actual work required, or is it just sitting on the calendar making everybody sweat without any kind of relevance to actual work that needs to happen to get there? Oftentimes, the process reveals the problem quickly, not because the team was failing, but because the structure was too loose to support the project cleanly. Okay, here's what I encourage you to do this week. Pick one stalled project, just one. Name the priority. Assign clear owners. Surface open decisions. Map handoffs. Re-rank active work. Audit the next deadline. Do not try to fix your entire organization and all of your projects in one day. Take one project that feels heavy or dragging and run this diagnostic honestly. Once you can actually see why the project is dragging, it becomes much easier to fix the right thing at the right time. And that's the point. The goal is to not add more noise. It's to remove friction to keep work moving forward. So that's it. That's the framework. When projects stall, I don't think the first answer is more pressure. I think the first answer is more clarity. Clearer priorities, clearer ownership, clearer decisions, and clearer handoffs. This is what reduces wasted motion. This is what cuts down on confusion. This is what helps teams get momentum back without burning themselves out trying to compensate for a structure that's way too unclear. Good people can do amazing work, but they shouldn't have to waste half their energy chasing, guessing, redoing, and circling back. If this kind of operational drag feels familiar to you, this is exactly the kind of work I help organizations untangle. If you want to stay in touch, you can find me through NSL Arts and Consulting. I work with nonprofits and small businesses on project management consulting, operations design, systems training, and AI implementation. Thanks for joining me, and keep in touch.